It was the end of the year, and Serah's heart was beating fast with excitement. For the first time, she was going to meet John, the boyfriend she had fallen in love with after 9 months of talking online. Those months had been like a dream, full of sweet messages, happy calls, and promises of a future together. Serah loved John deeply, and he loved her just as much, or so she thought. This was also Serah's first time in Africa. She sat nervously at the airport, holding her suitcase tightly and looking around. Suddenly, she saw a tall man walking toward her with a bunch of flowers in his hands. John. Her heart skipped a beat. She jumped up, ran into his arms, and hugged him. They kissed like they had waited forever for this moment. The couple got into a taxi and started the trip to John's village. As the busy city streets turned into quiet roads and tall trees appeared, Serah felt excited, but when the taxi stopped at a quiet junction, she felt a bit confused. "This is as far as cars can go," John explained with a smile. "My village doesn't have roads for cars yet. We'll take a motorcycle from here." They climbed onto a motorcycle and rode on a bumpy path until it stopped near a wide river. Serah looked around, puzzled. "Why are we stopping here?" she asked. John pointed across the river. "My village is just on the other side. The bike can't cross the water. But don't worry, I'll carry you across, it's not far." Serah hesitated but nodded. She thought the trip was fun and adventurous, but deep inside, she felt a tiny bit uneasy. The river was busy with people. Some were swimming, others washing clothes, and a few were sitting and chatting. Everyone turned to look at Serah and John as they got closer to the river. John called a young boy nearby to help carry Serah's luggage. Then he bent slightly, asking her to climb onto his back. She held him tightly as he stepped into the cold water. As they crossed, Serah heard 2 girls washing clothes nearby. They were whispering, but their words sent a chill down her spine. "I think she's the sacrifice for this year," one of them said with a nervous giggle. Serah's eyes widened, and she turned to look at them. "What are they talking about?" she asked softly. John paused for a moment, but then smiled. "Don't mind them, they are not talking to you," he said in a calm voice. When they reached John's house, Serah felt a little more at ease. His father and 2 younger siblings stood at the door, waving and smiling. They welcomed her warmly, shaking her hand and helping with her bags. The house was small but cozy, with clay walls and a thatched roof. Serah sat in the living room, taking in the new surroundings as neighbors began to arrive one after the other to meet her. Everyone seemed excited to see her. They smiled at her, some asking questions about where she came from, while others just stared at her like she was someone very special. Then a small boy ran into the room. It was Bryan, John's 10-year-old nephew. His face lit up when he saw Serah. "Serah," he shouted, running toward her and throwing his arms around her. Serah laughed and hugged him tightly. Bryan had spoken to her a few times on the phone when she talked to John, so he already felt close to her. She reached into her bag and pulled out a pack of chocolates and an iPad she had brought as gifts. Bryan's eyes grew wide. "For me?" he asked, his voice full of surprise. "Yes, for you," Serah said with a big smile. Bryan jumped up and down, clapping his hands. Thank you," he said, hugging her again. The room filled with laughter as Bryan showed the gifts to everyone. Serah felt a little happier now. The family was kind, and she could see how much Bryan adored her. That night, after she had freshened up, Serah lay down on the bed in John's room to rest. The room was simple, with a wooden bed. She picked up her phone, wanting to call her sister and tell her about her day, but when she looked at the screen, there was no signal. "John," she called out, "I can't get any internet here." John came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "The network here is bad," he explained. "I'll go to town tomorrow and get you a service that works in this area." Suddenly, Bryan came rushing into the room, looking worried. "Uncle John, there are some men outside looking for you," Bryan said softly. John's expression changed. He stood up quickly and told Serah, "I'll be right back. Just rest." Serah nodded. She watched as he walked out, leaving the door slightly open. In the living room, 3 elderly men stood waiting. They were dressed in long, worn clothes, their faces serious and unreadable. John greeted them quietly and immediately motioned for them to step outside. Bryan, curious and uneasy, followed quietly and hid behind the door to listen. Once outside, one of the men spoke in a low, deep voice. "Is everything ready for tonight?" John nodded silently. The man continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small dark bottle. He handed it to John. "Put this in her drink or food. Make sure she takes it before midnight. We will return at 1 a.m. for her." Bryan's eyes widened as he listened, his small hands clenched into fists. John hesitated for a moment, but then took the bottle without saying a word. He turned and walked back inside the house. John carried a bucket of water outside to take his bath, the sound of the bucket scraping the ground breaking the silence of the night. Their small bathroom stood in the corner of the compound, dimly lit by the moonlight. Inside, Serah lay on the bed, trying to push away the strange feeling growing in her chest. The night had started so beautifully, yet something felt off. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and little Bryan sneaked into the room, his small frame barely making a sound. He looked scared, his wide eyes glancing nervously behind him. "Miss Serah," Bryan whispered, his voice trembling, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to tell you something now." Serah sighed, thinking it was just another one of Bryan's usual interruptions. Earlier, he had come in twice, once to thank her again for the chocolate and iPad, and then to ask how to play a game. She smiled weakly and said, "Bryan, I'm really tired. Come back tomorrow, okay?" Bryan hesitated, his small hands clenching into fists. He turned to leave, but suddenly spun back around. "Miss Serah," he said, his voice urgent now, "Uncle John is going to give you a drink or food when he comes back. Please don't drink or eat it." Serah sat up, startled. "Bryan, what are you talking about?" But before she could say another word, Bryan turned and ran out of the room, closing the door behind him. All the way to 7, Serah's heart pounded so loudly she was sure John could hear it. After finishing, John placed the pot on the floor and whispered something she couldn't understand. Then he left the room, closing the door firmly behind him. A loud click followed as he locked it from the outside. Serah waited until his footsteps faded. Then she stood up and ran to the door, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She felt trapped, panic rising in her chest. She glanced around the small room, her eyes landing on a tiny window. It wasn't large, but it might be her only way out. With all her strength, she climbed onto the table beneath it and squeezed her body through. She fell to the ground outside, her knees scraping against the dirt, but she didn't stop. She pushed herself up and began running into the dark, cold night. The village was eerily quiet. The tiny road stretched endlessly before her, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to whisper as the wind passed through. Serah didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop. The farther she ran, the darker it became. Her breaths came in short, sharp gasps, her legs trembling with exhaustion. After what felt like forever, she spotted a faint light in the distance. As she got closer, she saw a small, old hut. Outside sat an elderly woman, her wrinkled face barely lit by a dim lantern. She was taking snuff, her eyes sharp and observant. Serah stumbled toward her, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Ma," she cried. "Someone is after me. Please let me stay here until morning. I don't know where to go." The old woman squinted at Serah, her expression unreadable. She seemed to think for a moment before finally nodding. "Come inside," she said in a raspy voice. The woman led Serah into the hut. It was small and simple, with only 2 rooms. A small fire crackled in one corner, its faint light casting shadows on the walls. "Sit down," the woman said, pointing to a mat on the floor. Serah dropped to the floor, crying softly, her body trembling. "What happened, girl?" the woman asked, sitting beside her. Serah tried to speak, but her words came out jumbled through her sobs. I don't know. My boyfriend wants to hurt me. I ran. I don't know what to do." The old woman's face softened. She placed a hand on Serah's shoulder. "You're safe here," she said. "No one will harm you. Rest now. We'll figure it out in the morning." John and some elders gathered at the village shrine. The air smelled strange, like burning leaves, and everything was very quiet. The men wore white cloth tied around their waists, their faces looking serious. They worked together, setting up the stone altar. The stone looked old and cracked, with dark stains that never went away. When they finished, the chief priest lifted his hand. "It is time," he said in a deep, strong voice. No one said anything as they started walking back to John's house. At the house, John opened the door and stepped inside. He looked at the bed where Serah had been lying, but it was empty. He froze, staring for a moment, then shouted, "She's gone." She ran away. The other men looked at each other in shock before grabbing their lanterns and sticks. "Spread out," John shouted. "Find her. Don't let her escape." The men split up and began searching the village. They shouted her name, their voices loud and angry. They looked behind trees, inside huts, and down every path. Meanwhile, Serah was hiding in a small hut far away. The old widow who lived there sat beside her, calm but serious. The woman looked at her young son and whispered, "Go to the shrine. Tell them the girl is here." The boy nodded and ran out of the hut, his bare feet slapping against the ground. A few minutes later, the door suddenly burst open. The men had found her. Their faces were hard and scary. "There she is," one of them shouted. Serah screamed and tried to back away, but the men grabbed her. She kicked and cried, "Please let me go. I didn't do anything wrong." The men didn't listen. They dragged her out of the hut and back toward the shrine. The road was dark and Serah tripped several times, but they didn't stop. When they reached the shrine, smoke filled the air. Strange drums were beating softly in the distance. The chief priest stood waiting, his face painted with strange lines. The firelight flickered on him, making him look like a shadow monster. "Put her on the altar," he said. The men tied Serah to the cold stone. She screamed and begged, pulling at the ropes, but they wouldn't come loose. The priest walked closer, holding a clay bowl filled with powder. He blew the powder into Serah's face, and her body stopped moving. Her eyes slowly closed, and she became very still. The men stood around the altar as the priest started chanting. His voice was low and creepy, like the wind in a haunted forest. A small goat was brought forward. It cried loudly, but no one cared. The priest took a sharp knife and quickly ended the goat's life. Its blood spilled onto the altar, dripping near Serah's body. Thick smoke rose from the fire and swirled around the altar. The smoke moved like it was alive, twisting and crawling toward Serah. It entered her nose and mouth as her body twitched slightly, but she didn't wake up. The men cooked the goat's meat over the fire. They ate in silence, their faces calm, like they were having a normal dinner. John sat with them, chewing slowly, his eyes on Serah the whole time. After they finished eating, the priest stood up and raised his hands. "The final part of the sacrifice will happen tomorrow at midnight," he said. "Go and rest. Come back when the moon is high." The men nodded and left the shrine, one by one. Serah was left tied to the altar, her body still and quiet. Morning came, and John's house was full of noise. Neighbors and friends were coming in and out, smiling and shaking hands with him and his family. It looked like a celebration. John sat in the middle of the living room with his mother and some elders, drinking palm wine and laughing. "The last part of the ritual is tonight at midnight," John said quietly. "Once it's done, everything will be over. We'll leave for the shrine by 11 p.m., but I need to take some palm wine and cola nuts there this afternoon." Bryan sat in a corner, quiet and scared. He was holding a stick and pretending to play, but his mind was racing. He looked up and said, "Uncle John, can I come with you?" John frowned. "No, Bryan. This is not for kids. Go outside and play with your friends," he said firmly. Bryan nodded and walked out. That afternoon, John walked to the shrine carrying a small basket with palm wine and cola nuts. The shrine looked dark and creepy, even in the daytime. The trees around it were thick, and the air smelled of smoke and something strange. When John entered, he saw the chief priest sitting on the floor near the altar, but then his eyes fell on Serah. She was awake, lying on the cold altar. Her face was pale, and her eyes were swollen from crying. "I brought the palm wine and cola nuts," John said quickly, trying not to look at her. But then he turned to the chief priest. "Why is she awake?" "I thought the spell would keep her asleep until tonight."